Consider This, with host Carol Schrader, is supported in part by Better Business Equipment and by Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider This, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to UNO. This is really kind of a fun show for me. I'm having a former professor of mine at UNO in the journalism department. He's now retired, Warren T. Franke, Dr. Warren T. Franke. It always had a kind of a lyrical ring to it.
I always wanted to change my name. My middle name's Theodore, and I always wanted to go for Ted, but somehow I'd been Warren too long. It's easier to say Ted, than Warren.
Well, I think Warren Franke has a great ring. The reason Warren is here is that since his retirement, he's been very busy on a project, writing a book. And this is a very special book to him, and in some ways it'll be a very special book to a lot of people in Omaha. The name of it is The Way Was Clear, the Centennial History of Dundee Presbyterian Church, 1901 to 2001. And
that's this year.
Yeah,
we had to get it done. No question.
So this is the centenary of
yeah, we started in May 6, 1901, and actually met a few times before that when the people of Dundee decided they were tired of taking two streetcars, one from Dundee to 40th and Farnham and one downtown, to go to church, or to take the horse and buggy to church in those days. And they decided they needed a church in the village of Dundee, which was a separate village. I was going to say, if you remember, but no, you don't remember it.
Not quite that.
And I don't remember.
But I remember the history.
But it was a separate village, a village in which no spirituous liquors were allowed to be sold.
Boy, that's changed now.
And a village, yeah, that's true. There is a place. What is
couple
its
of
name?
them.
There was also an idea they had that they lived up a little higher than downtown, that the air was clear, that you really, if you lived in Dundee, you didn't need to go to see a doctor. They said that to people who wanted to move there. So they were proud of that little community. I think my favorite story about what a community it was when they talked about how in the wintertime, horse-drawn plows cleared the snow from their sidewalks.
Maybe that's what we need today.
This last winter I thought about that. Where is our horse-drawn plow to clear our street?
Tell me how you got started on this. You're obviously a congregant.
Yeah.
And come from a long line of...
I come from a long line of Lutheran ministers, but I had a daughter who got involved at Dundee Church as a late grade school, high school, and she became very immersed in church activities. And
being a good parent, you kind of...
Yeah, we sort of were drawn there from my old Lutheran ties. And but I haven't been a member nearly as long as a lot of the people I've written about. So I wasn't especially qualified to write about the church because of my longevity. But when they asked for someone to volunteer to do it, I wasn't.
They didn't find too many people. If they knew what all was involved.
Well,
that's
right.
now.
But also it appealed to me because history is my field as a journalism educator. That is my doctoral field. I wrote about the history of investigative reporting in the 19th century, and I had done lots of historical writing. I'd fairly recently done one chapter in a team-written biography of Chuck Durham, the leader of HDR, and a man with global engineering accomplishments. And I wrote the chapter on Chuck Durham from birth in Chicago near Wrigley Field to his graduation from Iowa State University. I had a great time doing that. Worked with my old colleague Bob Riley, who edited that book. And so there were a variety of things that sort of put me in, I thought, a good position to be the one to write the history.
Now, when you write a history, obviously it takes all kinds of things. And I think that what you sort of told me that you had to go through in terms of written documents, piecing together, getting the people that were left alive to...
Oral history interviews with many people.
This is how anybody would go about. I mean there's a lesson in this. You could almost kind of give a tutorial about certainly church history.
I would suspect that churches in general are pretty good record keepers. And I can't tell you, if you want your heart to beat a little faster, pick up an old ledger and then realize you're reading the handwritten minutes of the first meeting held even before the church was organized in the hand of Dr. Lamp, the founding seminary professor, and then to find hidden in a page where another page was stuck to it, much later finding that there on that page were two photographs that I just love. One, they're in the book. One of them shows an unpaved Underwood Street looking up towards 50th Street. You can see the building where Bomb Drug is today, but unpaved, with a streetcar out in the middle of the street at the top of the hill, and a woman in a broad-brimmed hat standing there alone, a silhouette getting on the streetcar.
It's a wonderful picture.
Yeah, you saw that
wonderful
one. And then
picture.
there's another one looking down unpaved 50th Street, where you can actually see the church sitting there where a gas station is now. And those
where
were,
it used to be.
Yeah. And then when you find pictures, after you've been, here's what's really exciting. You've been reading about these people, and then you suddenly discover there are some beautiful formal portraits of a group of what they called the women's Bible class and the men's Bible class. And these are the people I had been reading about now for some time. And then well, that's what they looked like. And by the way, in that picture, all the women but one are wearing these wonderful hats. And then when you see, there's even a picture of a little boy's Sunday school class. So it was great to find those things to get some actual visual impression of those people.
You know, we have many churches in Omaha who are 100 years old or hovering past it, and
Sure.
or hovering near it.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think those churches, just because those congregations, because they've been there, and they might have been at another site earlier,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
because they've been around so long, they have a sense of history anyway that a lot of some of the newer churches don't have. But what is it, do you think, about getting it down in black and white?
Well, you know, the story, there are people that know the stories, are part of the stories. And I think what doesn't happen is until you sit down to write a history, you don't get that comprehensive look, and you also don't get it in a compressed way. It's quite a different experience to read, for example, about the entire experience starting a couple years before World War II until that experience ends, and in a concentrated period of time. You know, maybe in a week of solid reading and note-taking, you're experiencing that entire decade. And for example, you're experiencing little newscaster notes. The newscaster or the weekly bulletin of the church would say, so-and-so and so-and-so is left for military base here. And I can remember one that particularly sticks in my mind. Lieutenant Robert Crosby is leaving San Francisco on a ship for Hawaii in November of 1941. So immediately you're worried about, well, what happens to him? Is he unfortunately in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack there or something? And later on you hear what happens to him. And you follow other people like that and their return from the war, their letters home. And of course, most poignantly, a letter home from someone who is lost at war, but writes at home about how he misses the Blackstone dinner at the Blackstone Hotel, or playing football in the Happy Hollow, what we call the Sunks down there, and so on, and writing stories like that. And then I think, to me, one of the most touching things to read, to give a sense of how that war impacted lives, was to read that 3 years after the war ended, the session, our ruling elders were asked to vote to stop singing America at the start of every church service. And in 1948, they voted, no, we'll continue to sing America at the start of every service. So you experience what it must have been like for them in those years.
The feeling of the era.
Yeah.
There are, you were able to bring out what many people already knew in bits and pieces. In any kind of history, they know the bits and pieces, but sort of the historical links to UNO. Then OU, Omaha University.
Yeah, it's really strange because
we should say where the church is.
The church.
It is not far from this campus.
The church was at 50th and Underwood,
Correct.
and then it moved down the hill west to Happy Hollow and 53rd, roughly, but mostly people just think of it as Underwood and Happy Hollow, across from that green median that
wonderful
runs
old
up Happy
church
Hollow.
and
Yes, a very traditional Gothic church, and it has it's been there since 1928. But the people who were here before it moved there still think of that as the new church, even if it's over 70 years old now. But if you want to hear the story about the Omaha UNO connection.
Well, I think it's interesting because just because of the geographic space, very small between UNO, and there are just a lot of connections over the years.
A wonderful man of God named Dr. Joseph Lamp, a man with both divinity background but also a PhD in Semitics, has been preaching at a New York church for many years, and he ends up in a very controversial situation. He prosecutes a heresy trial, the most famous one in history of the Presbyterian Church in America. And when he's done prosecuting that, he wins the prosecution of this man for his Bible teaching. That man and the seminary which Dr. Lamp graduated from leave the denomination over it, and Dr. Lamp is seen by some as persona non grata in New York. So he leaves the brick and the cement the concrete of New York, they say because his wife would like the green and open spaces of Omaha. And they find themselves in downtown Omaha teaching at the seminary. But they hear good news. The seminary is going to buy land in the Dundee area, so he moves to Dundee. The land deal falls through. He's stuck in Dundee, so he's there to start the church. But meanwhile, he had taken the young ex-president of Parsons College, young Dr. Daniel Jenkins, who was the youngest college president in the country at the time. He came here as a professor. He talks to Lamp, and Lamp convinces him to live in Dundee. So there is Dr. Daniel Jenkins helping found Dundee Presbyterian Church, but the seminary moves instead to North Omaha. Dr. Jenkins moves to North Omaha. He starts Omaha University there in 1908, 7 years after the church is started, and he heads Omaha U from 1908 until his death in the mid-1920s. So this little Presbyterian college, Omaha University, is started by this Presbyterian seminary professor. The ties stay strong. We had as you look at the history after it becomes a municipal university, all kinds of church members are regents. The dean of the law school, we used to have a law school, was Elmer Thomas, one of the more interesting characters in Dundee church history. Elmer Thomas's home is dynamited by the Denison machine in 1905 in Dundee.
Big controversy
Oh,
at
yeah.
the time.
And they have a meeting at the church, and there's outrage in the community. Elmer Thomas later becomes the Elliot Ness of Nebraska. He's the prohibition enforcer for Nebraska, and an officer of the church and so on. And then later he's the dean of the law school here. I think one of the strongest connections between the church and the university comes when Charlie Hoff becomes the business manager of the university. He decides the Congenial Couples, a group that started in 1939 with Howard Buffett, who becomes our 4-term congressman and the father of Warren Buffett, is their teacher, and they are invited to come to this university and serve banquets to raise funds.
And this was a long-standing tradition.
This started in the 1940s and continued into the 1990s.
Because I remember going to banquets
Sure.
here when I was in college and seeing these generally elderly people, but not always, and
But you
say,
would-
where did these people come
You would
from?
see the heads of surgery and other departments at the University Med Center, people like Dr. Bob Grissom and Dr. Paul Hodgson, department heads at the Med Center, serving as waiters with their white shirts and black ties and black trousers. So that lasted for about 50 years. And out of that period comes the time when Milo Bale becomes one of our most prominent leaders who led the growth of this university. Dr. Bale's an officer of Dundee Presbyterian Church. He's also, as in addition to be president of the university, he's the church's chairman of the music committee. So when a choir director leaves Dundee Church, the elders say, Dr. Bale will find us a new choir director who will be a graduate of the Westminster Presbyterian Choir School, and he'll also be the vocal music director for Omaha University. So in that sense, there was probably too close a tie for the comfort of some of the people in the music faculty at that time when Dr. Bale, and by the way, that was not unusual for Dr. P. Milo Bale, to hire a member of a faculty pretty much on his own and then tell the faculty of that department later who he had decided to hire. This was before some rather stringent rules about how you do those things came to university life.
You know, though, if you add up now this, but the histories of some of those older churches I mentioned earlier, you do have the bits and pieces of the history of Omaha. I mean, you have,
Sure.
but
Oh,
the
sure.
church was, churches and
Yeah.
church life of Omahans
Yeah.
was huge then.
You know, it's interesting to see it in the mid part of this century. Dr. Ed Stimson comes to Dundee Church in 1953. 6'7", broad-shouldered, tall man with a loud voice and very much an activist in every respect. Some people would have considered him, would have put a right-wing reactionary label on him, and then they would see him marching up 24th Street with the black ministers when Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Or you'd see him as with the Human Relations Board. But he was a fervent activist. He tried to run corrupt judges out of office. He did all these different things. And he had men in the church who were leaders in the community. And probably the best example of this would be Al Sorensen.
Former mayor of Omaha.
Well, and the thing that's interesting, I thought one interesting example of of some church community connections. Al Sorensen, before he becomes the council president and head of the Charter Convention, he is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. And he meets with A.F. Jacobson. who was the head of Northwestern Bell, and another officer of Dundee Church. And they think it would be wonderful to bring that Western Electric plant here. And they have an advantage, because a former member of Dundee Presbyterian Church is now the head of Western Electric, becomes the president of AT&T, Frederick Kappel. So those three men, Al Sorensen of the Chamber of Commerce, A.F. Jacobs of the Northwestern Bell, Frederick Kappel, either former or current members of Dundee Church, get together and bring Western Electric to Omaha. Of course, we have congressmen like Buffett, and we have, I think probably the most significant.
Well, didn't you have another congressman?
John McCollister.
John Y. McCollister.
John Y. And John Y., of course, also played a significant role in scouting in this community, founding the Mid-American Council. But I think probably the most profound change that was affected by members of Dundee Church in action with others in the community was when when the voters elected 15 people to head a charter convention to change our form of city government. 5 of the people on the charter convention were from Dundee Presbyterian Church. The head of the charter convention was Al Sorensen. Al Sorensen comes out of the charter convention after leading to that new form of government, and he's elected to the city council. He's then elected president of the first city council under the new charter, and later on elected mayor. Ed Stimson, the pastor Ed Stimson, who was such an activist, he was there at that first city council meeting in 1957, in May of 1957, to give the invocation. That same month he hosted the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, all the Presbyterians in America coming to Omaha for that meeting. And in the same month, sadly, after experiencing those great triumphs, he was going between hospital calls, and a small boy ran out between cars in front of his car, and he accidentally hit the boy and killed him. So yeah, it's hard to imagine what kind of a month that might have been in the life of that, leader of the church, to have had these great successes and then have something horrible like that happen.
Because you liked history, so at least in your chosen field, but I'm sure, I would guess you just like history in general.
Well, yeah. I'm a media historian primarily, but I've discovered that writing an institutional history, especially if it's a church you care about and people you know, it's a great joy.
Did it cross your mind many times when you were writing this, all the histories that are not written?
Yeah. And I started thinking about ones I'd like to write. And you can actually make a personal list. I mean, almost anyone could. Most families have someone in it who does all the genealogical work.
Right.
One person, and the rest of the family is grateful for that, but they don't really want to quite get into that. And I haven't really explored the connection between one of my ancestors who has had a biography written about him, the August Hermann Franke, it is in Deutschland. People have written about his work in the 17th century, but I haven't known enough about the gaps between him and my grandfather and some of the other people in there. That intrigues me. I keep promising the chairman of the communication department I'll write a history of the communication department and its predecessors, the speech and journalism departments. And I think almost everyone has at least some history that they personally care a great deal about, that they would enjoy researching and writing about.
What, when you were putting this together, what was your greatest challenge? Now let me throw something out, and I'm not asking you to tell all or anything, but churches are in addition to being an institution of God, they are also institutions of humans. I mean, they make them up. Now, certainly in the history of Dundee Presbyterian, as any church, there are certain politics within the church. Was there anything,
Well, I tell you,
anything was taboo? Or?
Well, one thing that I had was a wonderful kind of support and encouragement, is I had a very wise man, Ray Crossman, an attorney, who since has had some health problems, but through the first 6 chapters, he worked with me a lot, and later on he continued to follow through with me on the book. And I had him reading what I wrote, and I had some other very capable people, Pastor Emeritus Paul Lindell, a man who, one of the best editors I've had read my work in my life, and I've tossed a lot of things back and forth with my friend Bob Riley and others, but Paul Lindell notices certain things that other people seem to not notice when he reads. So that helped me. But getting back to the question of, let's say some touchy issues in a church, one thing that intrigued me, when you're getting in an era where there's probably no one you can interview, let's say in an earlier period, to find out what happened, sometimes you're reading something and you're puzzled by what you're seeing. For example, the church grows pretty rapidly from 1901 to 1910. Then it levels off from 1910 to 15. Now, one could guess that maybe it had something to do with the minister, but not much way of telling, because you're not going to find things in the session minutes or any other sources that tell you about that. But then fortunately, Dr. Stimson knew the family of Professor Lamp. He had 3 sons that went into great successful ministries and grandsons who did. One of the Lamp sons wrote about Dr. Fisher, who was the minister from 1910 to 1915.
Oh, these missing kind of
In a
years?
letter, he wrote, he was a Puritan of Puritans, whose rules on the smallest matters were very harsh indeed. Now, Dr. Fisher leaves in 1915 about the time that Billy Sunday comes to Omaha, promising to fight the devil when he's old, and he says, I'm going to kick the devil, and I'm going to hit the devil with my fist, and when I'm old and footless and fistless, and then I'll bite the devil, and when I'm toothless, I'll gum the devil. And Billy Sunday attracts people in Omaha to churches all over. Almost all the churches in Omaha grow while he's here in 1915. That's also the year that Dundee's annexed into the city of Omaha. And it's the year in our church records that the clerk of the session, the man who sort of presides with the moderator at the meetings of the church officers, resigned so as not to be a hindrance to the growth of the church. Combine the letter from Dr. Lamp's son with that resignation, and it's pretty clear that the harsh rules of Reverend Fisher might have had something to do with the church not growing in a 5-year period when it should have grown quite distinctly. Plateau, Reverend Fisher leaves, Billy Sunday comes to town, the church growth doubles in in a couple years' time. And you wouldn't know, but if that letter hadn't been there, I really wouldn't have had that insight into that.
And I don't think that there is a long-standing church around that looks back and they're starting to look through things or they remember, we didn't really grow that much. I mean, that didn't wonder why that, peaks and valleys in any congregation.
But when you look at this history, you come to believe, I did more fully than I had before, in the idea of a calling and the idea that there is something taking place that is more than coincidence when the right person comes to a church at a certain time. A man came here in the 1920s who by all rights should have never ended up in Dundee, in Omaha. He had been, at the age of 29, named the minister of First Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., succeeding one of the most famous preachers of the day whose sermons were published in a number of volumes of books. And this man, Donald MacLeod, finds his way somehow to Omaha in 1924 to lead the way in the campaign to build the church that now exists there in Happy Hollow. A man of great leadership abilities. It's one of the more sad moments in the church's history when he decides to leave. And most of the times when a minister offers to leave, his resignation or his decision is accepted. In this case, there was a lot of pleading and a lot of calling him back and trying again, promising to do better and all this, and to get him to stay. But each minister seems to come at the right time. In the 1930s, Howard Talbot comes. He, by the way, starts the Church of the Air, the first radio broadcast of a church service in Omaha in 1930. It didn't stay on all the time, but it's been on almost all the time since, over 70 years. But Talbot was a wonderful, gentle, one-on-one pastor, as all the people that remember him as somebody who was so good with a personal touch with people. And that was really needed during the Depression.
What a wonderful style for radio, for that medium of radio.
But it wasn't the time to build, of course, because they were lucky, and he was not always paid, and his salary was reduced at times. When they come out of the Depression, and it's time to build, he leaves, and this unusual man, Dr. Elwood Rousey, comes from Toledo, Ohio, and the World Herald headline refers to him as a master showman. And Rousey was a flamboyant preacher.
Rousing Rousey.
Absolutely. And people remember him, the late Kermit Hansen, that wonderful man who was a regent of this the university system and so on. Kermit told me about one time, other people described him to me as standing in the pulpit, his large hand, he had sort of a look of a fullback or a linebacker up there, big diamond rings flashing as his hands are on the edge of the pulpit. He liked to have an organist playing a little jazz in the background while he prayed. He was such a marvelous preacher.
It's not very Presbyterian, is it?
He's one of those preachers of his day who took on Clarence Darrow. Oh, well, the choir director quit at his previous church in Ohio because he brought a jazz band into the church. So he wasn't conventional. And as I say, and he debated Clarence Darrow, and he would have the fan, a little fan blowing on the American flag during World War II, so that flag always rippled. And one time, the one that Kermit recalled is Kermit said, Elwood got through speaking. He had been such a spellbinder. The place was so hushed. It was packed always. It was hushed. And when he got through, he just bowed, and then he looked up and said, Lord, thank you for being especially with me today. And he had this sense that he had just had the crowd in the palm of his hand. He would do book reviews for the whole community, and people would crowd into the church, and that was used as a fundraiser for the women's organization of the church for their various causes that they supported. So he was a dynamic character. Only problem with Rousey is he didn't want to be around in the summer at all because he owned caves in Kentucky, and he wanted to run off to his caves in Kentucky to run those in the summer. I'm sure made
Tourist attraction down there.
They say that he made a lot more money in a couple months in the summer at his caves than he did preaching here in Omaha, and eventually that pulled him away from the church. But he, real performer.
You know, in all the years that I've known you, this may sound odd, but I mean, I don't think about you as being religious or not religious. You're always just Warren Franke. Very nice man, very bright man. Did this affect your faith at all? Just going back and doing all this?
I think it simply more strongly than lots of experiences, I think, if you have faith, tend to strengthen your faith. And this would be that kind of experience. But, you know, keep in mind, you knew me as a journalist and as a college professor.
And I wouldn't think that way of any of my...
And as a journalist, you tend to learn the idea of detachment, objectivity, and your goal is to, you know, I wrote opinion pieces and columns, but essentially in a secular situation. And I'm proud of some things I've written that have some religious significance, but they wouldn't have been seen quite in that light. Probably one of the best pieces of journalism I've ever done was the coverage of a Billy Graham crusade, which the Billy Graham crusade people liked, some people didn't like, but one that I'm particularly proud of. But it's great, though, to be able to work using all my experience as a writer and a researcher to do something that relates to my faith.
Well, the book is The Way Was Clear, the Centennial History of Dundee Presbyterian Church. And if you've ever thought about maybe having a church history done, you ought to call Dundee Pres and you can buy a copy, right?
Sure.
Okay, Warren Franke, thank you for being with us
Carol.
today.
Enjoyed it.
And remember, you can catch us on the internet. It's unotv.unomaha.edu. You can watch this program right on the internet. See you next week, and thanks for joining us.
Consider This, with host Carol Schrader, is supported in part by Better Business Equipment and by Nebraskans for Public Television.